Ready? Are you reading any little speech before we start or anything? Okay, why don't we start with that, then we'll get going. I think a few other people will probably show up, but.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kyle Kobe. I'm one of the planners here. I'll be helping facilitate the video portion of the meeting. I'm going to work alongside the chair to facilitate the meeting proceedings. A few housekeeping items for this hybrid meeting. The meeting is being recorded and broadcast.
Well, it's a delay.
Delay.
Apologies for that, everybody. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you are not speaking. The chat function for this public meeting is disabled. All chats will go directly to the Zoom facilitator. Unless you're participating in the meeting, please turn your video off. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting. When you are participating, you can turn your video on. If you have any trouble, you can send a chat to the Zoom facilitator. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody to the latest. We got the agenda out. We're going to cover the code assessment. I'm sure everyone has read it and digested it. You've read it at least. That's good. And it's going to be the next phase of our process. There is a public meeting after this. So again, sometimes we've let the public probably more participate in this meeting, but since we have one afterwards, we'll limit this to us unless we run out of time and then let the public participate in that meeting afterwards. And so I was going to read something real quick. I found these very old documents in the files at the law firm, including the 1966 original interim zoning ordinance. But I thought, thinking of Panasonic, I thought this was interesting. This was the summary of why they were creating a zoning ordinance for the first time in Lawrence. And it says, there's indications that the county is on the threshold of greatness and the greatest period of growth it's ever seen. Counties and cities along the Kansas Turnpike have experienced far greater rates of expansion than the remainder of the state. The construction of the Clinton Dam and the reservoir will attract many people from the greater Kansas City metropolitan area, as well as the capital city, Topeka. That was the basis for starting the whole thing, which I thought was fun. And then the original 1981 subdivision regulations had all these purposes to them, but like many of them are exactly what we're talking about in the context, including these should ensure shall conform substantially with the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinances. We should provide the conservation of existing neighborhoods and encourage the concept of neighborhood planning in new development. And we should coordinate development of each parcel of land within the existing community to conform with the comprehensive plan. And my favorite one, encourage the best possible use of each parcel of land through the application of urban design principles. So from 1981 on, we've been working on these same ideas. And some of the same themes are in the current plan, and I'm sure we'll carry some over in the development code. But anyway, I thought that was kind of fun. So I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to kick us off.
Thank you. That was fun. I'm wondering why you were looking around for old planning and zoning documents.
Lawyers always like to look around.
Who was mayor that year?
I don't know.
Marcy Francis.
Jack Brand's original.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. The presentation tonight is an update of our last one from December. We have some new information in there, and we're going to do a little stop and start so we can talk about stuff. We put the full code assessment out for everyone to review. I'm kind of hearing the conversation, maybe flip the pages, maybe you haven't made the most of everything in there. That's okay. We'll get going with where we are now, and we'll talk about where we're going to go forward, if that's okay with the group. Okay. All right, let's do next slide. Thank you. So tonight, we're going to talk about some of the key issues. We're particularly going to focus on the zone district update tonight. That's the next part that we're moving into. We will come back to some of the other key issues as we start drafting those sections. We could go through all of them tonight. But then a few months from now, I would say, remember when we talked about XYZ and you all be like, no, life got in the way. So we'll focus on the things we're going to draft next. We'll talk a little bit about some of the website feedback we've been getting and hope to still get. We will have steering committee discussion about different topics along the way. We'll talk about the public input meeting or the after party tonight that happens after this meeting. Talk about the drafting schedule for module 1 and talk about what we might do at the next steering committee meeting. Let's go ahead. Okay, remember, these are the goals for our project. To update the land development code to support and implement Plan 2040 and Lawrence strategic plan. I'm going to add in the downtown plan to that. Maybe I'll add in the downtown plan and the other plans and the plans on top of those plans. So, but we'll get them all in there. Identify opportunities to achieve city goals related to climate change, sustainability, housing, economic development, and other priorities. Establish a simpler and more consistent set of development procedures and make the entire land development code more user-friendly, searchable, and easy to understand. Next slide, please. Thanks for switching slides for me. Okay, so first up, we said in the assessment that we're looking at fine-tuning the zone districts. So we were looking at consolidating some zone districts, converting most of the commercial districts to mixed use, expanding the downtown zone district to better reflect the downtown plan, updating the IVP district, which we talked about a little bit at our last meeting, and consolidating GPI and H to make a public and civic mixed use district. So I wanted to go into a little more detail about how we move from these are the current zone districts to here we want to go with the next zone district. So we're going to kind of share how we look at it and think about it. And then we'll take questions about how it works or feedback about what you think about this. So let's go to the next slide. So we look at the base zone districts and we evaluate them to figure out if we should carry them forward, consolidate them, add new districts, and or adjust density on top of any of the rest of those. We, in particular, here in Lawrence, are looking at creating mixed use districts from the current commercial districts with tailored district specific standards. And we are looking at taking parts of the SMART code, which was created by taking a really detailed look at the community and seeing what is useful in there and incorporating it. The SMART code is form-based. It has not been used a lot. Has not been used a lot doesn't mean it's bad code. There could be a variety of reasons why people haven't chosen to use it. It could be hard to use. Harder than the current land development code would be interesting. We could do a comparison. But to make a form-based code like the SMART code, a lot of on-the-ground work has to take place, and we can take advantage of the information that the city has saved about what was on the ground when that was done. There have been some changes since then, but many of the neighborhoods remain essentially the same. So we'll take a look at that and see what we can mix in. Let's go to the next slide. Does everyone understand the difference between the code we're doing, which is kind of hybrid, and a form-based code? Do we need to talk about that at all?
Please
Pretty
do.
good.
Please do.
Please do. Okay. Okay. So the land development code it came out of a code platform called Euclidean. And that was that we would make base zone districts and we would separate things that don't belong together, particularly uses. Euclidean zoning was formally recognized by the United States Supreme Court in 1926 in the case of Euclid versus Ambler Realty. So if you were in ancient Greece or Rome thinking about Euclid, it's not quite that fancy. It's just the Euclid family brought this lawsuit. And so the purpose of zoning at that point in time was to separate uses that didn't belong together. That point in 1926 started us down this path of kind of siloing everything and saying residential, you go over there, and commercial, you go over there. That's not actually how we were building communities at that point in time. And we have some other communities that have a lot of mixes in the uses and structures, and they perform quite well. So, but Euclid took zoning down this path of separating everything. And we have kind of followed that train maybe to the end of the tracks at this point. But around the mid 1990s, early 2000s, form-based regulations came out of a more architectural approach to land development regulations. And one of the key concepts of form-based code is that we have communities that are built on structures and architectural form and design form. So our communities are more often oriented around structures than uses. Uses come and go. You can change uses in a building. The building is yours for a long time, even if it's an abandoned Walmart or Kmart. And so what form-based code does is they kind of switch priorities. So a Euclidean code, the most important thing you're doing is the use. A form-based code, the most important thing you're doing is a structure. And so we want to come up with more hybrid set of regulations. We care about uses and structures, so we're going to even that out a little bit. We'll bring uses down. There are use regulations in the current code that are not helpful at all. And we'll elevate structures so that we know that what's being built in the community that's going to be here for 50 or 100 years is something that works within the community. So those are our key differences. There are other permutations within there, but those are the two big basics. We okay with that? Okay, all right, let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so what we do to figure out if zone districts are working, first of all, is we take a look within the community of how much property within the overall structure is within the overall boundaries of the community is zoned in an existing district. So we look at like RS7 on the very top, 21%. So that's one of our highest residential districts. IG at 9.25. We use planned unit development for about 8.7%. So these districts across the top have enough use across the city that we think that they're functioning. They're functioning well enough that they're being used, being chosen for rezoning or being continued in what they were. So then we go down to the bottom of the list. You can see we've got mixed use at 0.03%, RS3 at 0.01%. There's something going on in some of these districts that tells us that they're not as functional. If a district is functional, people choose to use it. It's pretty Darwinian. And so we don't know exactly what's going on, but we go in and we look at the district. So like we could see the H district is only 11%, but that's the hospital, one hospital. So there's a reason for that. Why isn't the mixed use district being used though? Because that's something in current zoning that we tend to see a lot of. So we look at it, is it too challenging because within mixed use, you have to do sub districts of mixed uses and it's really hard to get to? Probably. So then we amuse ourselves, if you go to the next slide, by looking at it visually. So here's where you can see the dark blue square is OS, the orange square RS7. So we kind of see a lot of districts that are getting some pretty significant use. And then we get down to the tiny slivers on the right-hand side, and we have districts that are really barely being used. So we think there's something functional on the left side, something not as functional on the right side. But there are good concepts in some of the districts on the right side. So we want to back up and figure out why those concepts aren't being more widely accepted in the community. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that we heard coming into this project was that the community may feel like there are too many residential districts. So too many is a pretty relative thing. When my colleague and I were working on the Philadelphia Code a few years ago, they had 56 zone districts, and they weren't sure that was too many. So it varies community by community. What we look at with the too many, too few conversation is, are there meaningful distinctions between the districts, or did we at some point in time just come in and create categories because there were lot size breaks in there? And so just because of the lot size breaks in there, that tends to be more of that old school separating uses. So for some reason, people with very large lots cannot live next to people with much smaller lots. So that might have been taken to the extreme. So we're coming back and we're saying we can combine a few districts. So you can see that in the table in the code assessment. We're saying that we will carry forward some districts. And sometimes we're saying that maybe we need to take a district and not combine it, but change it. So like we're looking at the RM 32 multi-dwelling residential at 32 DU per acre, comparing that with the Plan 2040, comparing that with the types of density that you might see in a city the size of Lawrence with the uses and population demands you have here. And we're thinking, maybe the difference between 24 and 32 is not as significant. Maybe around or in downtown, we want to look at something else. And so that's a conversation we'll have. How do we have that conversation? We go in and we redraft the districts and we bring the draft and we say, here's what it is, here's what it looks like, because we're going to add graphics to the code. And here's where we think it'll get used going forward.
When you make a recommendation on combining,
Yep.
those, is that based on the numbers that you showed before, just in terms of frequency of use and with
Frequency of
our
use,
community? is
you
reflect-
guys communicating with us, like these distinctions aren't super meaningful, us looking around and saying, first of all, with residential districts in particular, these are minimum lot sizes, and we know there are going to be people out there with larger lot sizes. So we will probably have a conversation with you, like, do we want to go in and set a maximum lot size? If not, we probably don't need all of these, because if you have 7,000, you can have 10, 20, and 40 within that. So the question is, if Lawrence wants to get to additional density, where do we want to make it easier to do? And where do we want to say, hey, this is really where we want to see the density. So instead of having a maximum density, you're going to have a minimum density, or instead of having a minimum lot size, you're going to have a maximum
So
lot
it's not
size.
really a reflection of where we are in efficiencies. It's about setting direction.
It's about setting direction. One of the things in residential, though, that we don't want to do is go through and change this and create a whole set of nonconformities that don't exist. So a nonconformity is something that was legal under the old code that is no longer legal or permitted under the new code. And we tend to try to not do that, because then we just freeze that development in place. A nonconformity is usually allowed to stay and not allowed to change a whole lot. So we will also look at the zoning map, and we will look at the Google Earth to figure out what's out there and talk to communities. So the goal is to leave what's legal in place, but look about how we can get more redevelopment and infill in places where it's appropriate. Thank you. Okay, so that's kind of what we got going on with residential. Some of our conversation about residential will also be what sort of zoning do we need for in-town districts, and what sort of zoning do we need for more suburban or even more rural residential development. So that'll be part of this conversation going forward. Any other questions on this slide?
When you talk about replace, then what happens to the current properties that are, so if you're going to replace RM 32
Yeah.
with RM 54,
Yes.
then
So RM 32 still stays legal within RM 34. It doesn't.
but it means that anybody could take their property within RM 32 and develop it?
Yeah, to RM 54. And that's part of our discussion as we look at
Okay.
the district, right? And
I
that's
think we're going to have a conversation about that.
Yeah, we are definitely going to have we hope so.
Okay.
You shouldn't let us come in and say 54 and go home. So we hope to do that. But the question mark is good, because our drafting policy is to be more additive. So we don't want to go in and say we replaced your zone district and we took away everything that you thought you had. So when we combine districts, so looking at combining like RS7 and RS5, it's same story. In that case, the RS7 folks would be able to develop at RS5 because that's more permissive. So our goal is to head in the more permissive direction, not to say, oh, you were 40 and now you need an acre and you can't do anything. So we'll make sure that we circle back around and point that out, because it's not an intuitive conversation if you're not doing zoning every day.
So just the history is the RM 32, I think, came out of what was the highest use before the residential RD residential dormitory?
Yeah.
And that was put in place when they thought the dormitories were going to be built between the university and downtown. They did plating before zoning. So they couldn't amass enough lots to build the dormitories there, and they never did. But they left us with the RM32 zoning.
Mhm.
So it didn't work at RM32. Nobody could build to that density in much of that. And so just to add to that is going to create a little confusion.
Well, so I think that it's a really good point. One of the things that we're trying to balance in these changes is the current affordable housing situation and the current affordable and available housing situation. It could be that we end up staying at 32 and not going to 54, but we want to explore what that would look like in terms of an apartment complex or multifamily development.
And I'm not saying you don't need RM54
Yeah.
somewhere. But I'm just saying to say that everything that's RM32 was intended to be high density is probably not the case.
Okay, so part of this discussion will also be looking at the map.
Okay.
And it could be that we decide that there was stuff in there that, you know, leaving it RM32 is the great choice, or talking to those property owners about rezoning to something else is an even better choice.
You can build at 32 density in RM54.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But if you can't build to RM32 today,
In
zone it to
RM32.
RM54, you can't build RM54 either.
Right.
So
Right, so part of the problem is
Cuts both.
figuring out if
cuts both ways.
Yeah.
the path forward to RM32 or 54 is, if it needs to be allowed, and then thinking about the right place for it.
Yeah, and I understand that you couldn't build RM54, but we have people who then think that that's what they should do. Try to either combine.
Let 'em try.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
There's history to it, there's expectation to it, there's location to it. Everything that you're saying is absolutely correct and part of this discussion.
and let me ask a similar question on the other side. I mean, there's certain folks who want to do away with all the residential zones and just have a residential zone where you can do whatever you want based upon a form. A true form-based code would say, we have no limits on some of these, it's just more limit on form, not on any of these. Why are you recommending we keep some of these zoning districts at all? I guess it's kind of the other end of that question.
Yeah, so our reality with particularly residential is it's not going away. So whatever is there on the ground, usually your residential stays for a long time. You get periodic scrape offs. With the market where it is, you might see more scrape offs. But one of the other pieces that we want to get to is character and the character of the different neighborhoods, because that's so super important here. So we would keep the zoning in place for the most part because it reflects a piece of character. But part of our discussion is going to be, what is the important thing that we're doing here in the zone districts? Is it lot sizes? Is it uniformity across the street frontage? Is it where the street trees go? That's part of what we want to dig them into as we go further into this process, to be able to come back to these districts and say, well, we could roll 3 of them together because the same things are important. And then that would mean, less fighting over rezoning. So we want to gather up a little more information about how much distinction is actually out there in the way the community sees itself, and then come back to this discussion.
You said something that was interesting, and I don't know how interesting it is because I don't know how it's defined, and that kind of depends. So you said residential is not going away. Do you mean in the utmost sense of people living in houses in a city is not going away, or exclusive single family home residential zoning is not going away?
No, so what I mean is the single family houses
Right.
are likely not going
Okay.
away.
So the houses themselves,
The
not
houses
necessarily,
Themselves, right.
not necessarily the exclusivity, right? It's that may be on the table, right?
Well, lots of things could be on the table. We will, I imagine that we're gonna have a bigger discussion with this group and in the community about how much truly single-family detached zoning remains in place. There's discussion in communities, particularly those facing issues about housing affordability, about making a 2-family or a 3-family structure, the baseline that you start with. So that's, something we want to talk about. Where would that go? How would that work? And we know from Plan 2040 that the city wants to see more infill. Does infill mean that we set this up so some of these larger lots can be subdivided later into smaller lots with more development? So we have a lot of permutations to get into, and I appreciate that everyone wants to get there, which is why exactly when we get to this point of this being done, everyone's like, great, that's done now. Go get us some draft zone districts that we can look at. So, we're just highlighting for you, when we come back with the draft, this will be sort of more drafted out, and these are the conversations that we can dive into, and then you'll have numbers and information in front of you to talk about it. So I appreciate, these are all really good questions. Okay, all right, let's go on to the next one.
Oh, I just,
Yeah.
one more thing.
Yeah.
When, on the third one, or the last one, when you talk about Greek housing, we might want to also consider co-op housing.
Okay. Yeah, I think what you've pointed out, RC, is one of the great eternal questions in a college community that we're gonna go over again and again is, are the students gonna live here? Who's gonna live here? And how is this gonna work? And so.
And we don't have co-op housing,
Yeah,
so that needs to go someplace. And
yes. Yeah, well, and what we didn't flag on here is we probably will have conversations about tiny homes. We'll probably have conversations about RV parks as affordable housing. There's like a whole rest of this list that we're going to dive into, and we thought we wait until we had more detail in front of you, so you didn't have to guess with us where we were going. Okay, next slide. Maybe we might come back to it. Okay, so we were reading through the code, and there are a number of current commercial districts and the MU mixed districts. So for everyone's kind of to keep us on track with the conversation here, old school commercial, typical commercial is usually just commercial. It doesn't have residential mixed into it. When we say mixed use, that is residential plus something. Could be residential plus commercial, could be residential plus institutional, could be residential office. In some communities, we've seen residential and industrial. That can get a little more challenging because we have some safety problems with that, but we see it. So what we're recommending is to be more clear and to say in most places where you could do commercial, you can do mixed use, because the residential built in with the commercial usually lives pretty well together and gives us opportunities to add residential and to add density in places where people expect there to be density and cars and people moving around. So it doesn't create some of the pushback as redeveloping residential neighborhoods does. So we have listed 5 mixed use districts, and they vary in scale. And you can kind of see that by the name. So there's small neighborhood mixed use. I think of that, you could have like, in my mind, it's like Brookside in Kansas City, and I'm sorry, I can't think of an equivalent, Lawrence, but I will come up with one later. But, small shops and ice cream and little restaurant, and residential could be second story, could be behind. Larger neighborhood mixed use. So we might get into some 2 or 3 story, but still fairly low office or commercial. And then you would mix in some residential with that. You can have corridor mixed use that might be along some of the more intense corridors, collectors, or arterial streets. Community center mixed use, we tend to see more of that sort of mixed use with new development. So where they want to put in their own shopping area with the other hotels and residential uses that they want to do, preferably supporting pedestrian or transit oriented uses, and then downtown. So that's where we're going with that. The goal being to add the residential at a scale that works with where the commercial is located or could be located. So we got questions about this stuff.
Any reason why you picked 5? Is that just typical?
That's typical of the scale. We have 1 or 2 more that we might do, but we might also decide that corridor and community center are pretty similar and go together. So we start with 5 to hit the scale, and then we can back up and talk about it.
Okay.
Have you seen examples of communities that have changed their code in this manner, how that affected affordability?
I have seen changes in this manner affecting more so the commercial development. And so we did similar work up in Cedar Rapids. And they saw a fairly substantial change downtown, including the addition of a lot of residential, millions and millions of dollars worth of change and improvement. Now, I can't claim all of that was because of the code. It was probably coming anyhow, but the code, staff said the code made it easier to get that into the areas where they wanted to see it. So that's one sort of similar example. Cedar Rapids is about the same size as Lawrence is roughly. So I have also seen similar work in Billings, Montana, about the same size as Lawrence, and went with more of this mixed use kind of hybrid form-based code. And when I talked to their staff last year, they had also processed similarly millions of dollars worth of improvement, and they were seeing more residential downtown. I can check back with both of them and see what those numbers look like. And we can look around. This is a fairly common change that we're seeing in zoning codes these days.
I know this is an unfair question, but
Good.
What's an example of an existing commercial district in Lawrence right now that would get an MU1 or an MU2 designation?
So I think some of that is going to depend on how we're looking at redevelopment in some cases, because I know that there's the so when you look at the current districts and how they're going to get rolled in. So let's take a look at CN2 Neighborhood Shopping Center, which is proposed to go into MU2 large neighborhood. That the MU2 might be drawn out a little bit from the current districts of the CN2. So where do we have something that is a neighborhood shopping center? Can someone name one?
Hillcrest.
First of Louisiana,
What?
or no, I mean, 23rd Louisiana.
23rd in Louisiana. So
Right, I mean, that would be. Yeah, okay.
okay, so what we would want to do is, first off, take a look at what's on the ground to see if, we think what's there would stay, or if there is, room to go up or room to go out. And what we're hoping for is that because the residential market is where it is, making that change pushes some redevelopment either to parking or to structure height, or if whatever we're looking at is old enough and the income stream is insufficient at this point in time, just redevelopment altogether. So the goal is to make it easier to do the thing that could go there, because we know that banks are financing for this now, and it's easier to get in place than it was. We would have to talk about how it works with parking, how much of the lot we are going to hold out for parking, how we're going to make changes. If we're doing this in places where we have more walkability or more transit availability. But as we go through these, I think your question is really fair. What we want to do is pick up a few examples and talk about how the new district would work to kind of, poke holes in it, to see if it's actually going to get there, to see if we're, just changing the words in a way that's not going to get us anything, or to figure out what we think the enticement might be to move to the development the city would want to see, or the development community would want to move forward. Does that seem fair? Okay. Okay.
I just want to mention that in a recent rezoning case that came, I learned that the city has some prohibitions against having a corridor, and that they want to have their commercial separated. So that is something that we probably should discuss along with the corridor recommendation. They're saying we don't want to see this kind of development just all along,
Right.
but have more compact areas and then neighborhood and then compact areas.
Yep. Yep. So we will also talk about sort of what the size of some of these should be. Okay, other questions?
Is there the need, I guess, can't think of a better word, for some of these commercial areas that we might come back and say, you know what, this needs to just be commercial?
Yeah, that's usually a conversation that we end up having. It's helpful when we're doing that with a map in front of us because we come back and we're like, for whatever reasons, the traffic is such, or it's already got, XYZ heavier commercial uses on it that are never going to be good neighbors. So yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
So there still could be a C, some
We
kind.
could decide that there's just a straight up C something. Yeah, we try to start with a mixed conversation, but we can come back and say, leave it alone.
Well, maybe it's the same question. Where does Costco fit into
Yeah,
that zoning?
Costco, the Costco district. We'll do that as its own zone district. So it would fit into the MU3 corridor. But you wouldn't expect a lot of mixed use around a Costco. They like the parking lot. They like their low spread structure. So I think to Phil's question, that might be where we come back and say, we're going to keep, maybe the strip commercial, or we might keep something that's more of a, consumer commercial or auto oriented commercial or something. So we can have that conversation. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of everything else we are looking at. We had our brief conversation about the IBP, and we have agreed to do some research and come back. So we'll do that. The IL limited industrial will get carried forward. We think the medium industrial can get combined with the IL, but we'll take a look when we update the use table. That's another place where we do a comparison to see what can be combined or carried forward, and then we'll carry forward the IG general industrial. We have some special use districts that we think can be combined, particularly the general public and institutional and the hospital. So here's where MU6 is hiding. But what we're seeing in doing codes in other communities is that with particularly in communities that have stressed out housing markets, there are institutions like hospitals and churches and universities that have land. School districts have land. And as housing gets to a point where they can't house the people who work on their campus or with them or for them, we are starting to see hospitals put in their own housing. We're starting to see school districts put in their own housing. It may be that the housing affordability in Lawrence is not that extreme, but when you can't get, teachers, you're starting to have a pretty serious problem. So what we're doing to change that in the zone district to make it easy to do, to make it not as much a negotiated process, is say institutions or civic uses have an opportunity to do mixed use too. So if you're sitting on property and you want to put housing on it, that's something we can talk about. The other thing we're seeing in there is some institutions, hospitals in particular, are building out some of their sites with commercial uses, with tax generating uses. They're putting things on that, guests or long-term families who are in the hospital want, maybe a restaurant or a hotel or something like that. And most communities think that's a great use for the site. So that's another place we look at mixing that. So we'll bring that MU6 district forward and talk about whether or not it would work. Let me see. So we've got the UKU district gets carried forward. Open space gets carried forward, and urban reserve gets removed. It's not doing as much for us. You're going to carry.
Why would you remove urban reserve?
So I honestly can't remember off the top of my head. Gabby, do you remember what we were doing with urban reserve? So some of it is probably open space. Some of it can be served by another district. So, and I am sorry, I don't remember from when I did that. What goes on in urban reserve? Is it the holding district for annexation? Yeah. So the other thing that we do is we want to have a conversation about, we usually recommend that annexation come in with the zoning that you want to see instead of having it sit out in urban reserve. And that helps better plan infrastructure. It helps better with demographic projections, and it doesn't leave the neighbors with an unrealistic expectation that that's now their open park space for all eternity. And so we will have a discussion about it. This is another place where we tend not to push super hard. So we'll say, hey, what you really should do is think about what the development's going to look like and bring it in with that zoning. If we've done it this way for so long that people are going to be sad and cry over getting rid of urban reserve, we'll leave it there. But it tends to set a more realistic expectation to say, this is going to be, a mixed use 3 district out here. There's going to be residential, there's going to be commercial, and there's going to be traffic and people. So we'll have that discussion when we get there.
It's a little late for doing infrastructure master planning at that point in time, though.
It's a little late for it. We find, though, that it does change the tone of the conversation, and we know that there are other infrastructure planning issues that we're going to have to jump into.
Sure, but I mean, if you had your infrastructure needs to be planned at a community master plan.
Right.
Right. So I mean, yeah, if you're worried about it's going to be an MU3 district to determine whether you need to increase the sanitary sewer pipe size, then you completely missed the boat.
So tell us what, when we have properties sitting in urban reserve, help me understand, has that planning already taken place when it got annexed in, or is it a
Don't we have a community master plan? I mean, that's what
That's
Yeah, they're on different schedules. The annexation process is essentially a private matter.
But Plan 2040 is looking at, has plans to say what this might be, regardless if it's annexed, regardless if it's urban reserve. But yeah, that's what we use to plan out
utility
infrastructure.
should be looking at Plan 2040 to determine what the utility master plans need to be. They shouldn't be looking at me to tell them it's going to be MU3 or MU2, because if they have, then we're not doing any planning at all then.
so, okay, so. But I can't decide from this conversation if urban reserve is useful or if it's just, because it's still not telling us anything. So maybe it's not helping with infrastructure planning in the slightest. Is it helping with expectations?
I mean, I don't know if it's worthwhile or not. I mean, I was just curious that you remove it. The issue is, financially.
Yeah.
Is the city going to annex this ground or not?
Right.
To go to the next level and do all the work it takes to do your plans and a rezoning request and everything else in the world is a monstrous step when in fact you're not even in the city yet. And so it's simply an attempt, in my opinion, to overcome the hurdle that when you come into the city, you got to have some kind of zoning.
Mm-hmm.
And before you used to come in with just some kind of base, everybody comes in with RS7.
Right.
Okay, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? So because then you're tasked with trying to rezone from RS7 to, CC 600, that's a pretty big step.
Right.
And so that on the other hand gives the wrong impression, but you got to come into the city with something.
Because I haven't done annexation in Kansas for a good 20 years, but there's a time limit to like when the property has to be served, right? So
Yeah, but
planning,
it's out there quite a ways. I mean, it's just our ordinance says when you come into the city, you got to have some kind of zoning. Now, if we could accomplish that some other mechanism, but then you wouldn't need anything. I mean, could you come into the city with no zone? I don't know if that's.
Doesn't that depend on the type of annexation it is? What the
It does.
timeframe is?
The annexation will trigger the requirement for the service plan. So a consent annexation does not trigger the same timing requirement as a unilateral annexation under Kansas law currently.
Yeah.
Land Development Code today will require any property that's annexed into the city within 60 days to be rezoned to a category of choosing, or the city commission may rezone it to the UR category and hold it.
So it's a huge roadblock. You can't annex anything unless it's UR, because it just doesn't make any sense. It's a huge commitment on everybody's part that they end up just getting stuck.
Okay.
So if you take away UR,
It's like an opportunity for simplification.
It's kind of a little hurdle that I think we can figure out some way to work.
Yeah, I'm just gonna keep it flagged as a discussion issue, because it seems like we have, on both sides of it, we have some problems that we could maybe move into. So, okay,
But it was a fix at one point in time and it may not be the fix going forward.
wait, right. Okay.
And we can change the law.
Yeah, Marcy.
I'm just saying, if it's because of Kansas law and it's not working, we ought to look at that instead of like jumping around. I mean, although not in the next 2 years.
Okay, so let's keep this one.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So, we're gonna take a look at plan development. We're gonna carry it forward, but if you remember back a few slides, and Kyle, you don't have to go back, we do have a chunk of plan development in there. Plan development is really helpful in a certain situation, or planned unit development. But when we start seeing a lot of it, that is a symptom that the code's broken, because everyone's trying to work around what's in the code. We've already determined that we're fixing this code, but we want to go in and take a look at what's going on with planned unit development, simplify it some, and decide how to carry it forward. Then I said early on, we're going to take a look at what's going on in the smart code and see what we can integrate into the rest of our code.
Question about the plan. Sorry, were you gonna- I had a question about the plan development. So
Yeah.
in some parts of the code assessment, it kind of, it's saying plan development is not great. Like you were saying, it indicates broken code. It's a lot of workarounds. It's a larger percentage than it should be. And it almost constitutes a mini zoning code inside of a zoning code. So sounds problematic generally when you say it like that. But here it is, this carried forward. So given what you've said about the other zoning districts going forward, being more flexible, more open, a larger array of uses, sounds like that might fix the problem. I mean, were you really on the fence here, carry forward, or?
What we're really hoping is that the other districts fix the problem, but there is always a parcel somewhere that has so many issues that you're going to be looking for 15 variances from the code to develop it. And in that case, planned unit development is just probably a saner way to go.
Okay.
So I'm sorry. My insurance agent really wants to talk to me. Okay. But the other thing that we want to look at, and I know I'm venturing out onto thin ice here, is the whole idea of community benefits. And I know that I have a mixed crowd here, and I might be using the term community benefit completely differently than you guys know it and love it or hate it. So we're going to have a meeting about that. But in many communities, when you allow planned development, you are allowing someone to work essentially differently than the code works, and you ask for some benefit to the community as a trade-off for allowing that planned development. And one of the things that we're seeing is communities asking for housing, affordable housing in particular, as that community benefit. So we don't want to move away from places where we can incentivize housing. So we want to have a deeper discussion about that.
Was that capital A or little?
Both. Right. So we need to get little a affordable, more housing. Capital A affordable, defined as affordable housing. We're all going to be so expert at this at the end of it. Okay.
Just to be clear, do you see, you don't see the small code surviving after this? It's, we're going to have one code, not this parallel code thing, right?
Correct. Smart code,
Sure.
whatever we find useful in the smart code comes in the way that it's useful. And then we have a little going away ceremony.
Really?
Yeah, there'll be cake. Oh, yeah.
It's gonna be at the Leeds.
Oh,
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah.
Elizabeth, just,
Say goodbye to it and send it down the road.
Elizabeth, just to kind of close the door, as far as I'm thinking about PUD plan, and especially PRD, the reason we use that, and quite frequently, and the reason it's 9% of our use is it's not, we're looking for something special. It's trying to, it's trying to get around something that's broken.
Yeah.
So, and clearly and I think the answer for me in fixing what is broken is going to be in the dimensional code. dimensional section of the deal,
Okay.
because that's where the problems all lie, and that's why we use it, because that's what we're getting around.
Yes.
So-
Yeah, no, that's 99% of the time why we see that. And so as we go through the dimensional standards, we can talk about what gets in the way and what could get moved out of the way. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, next slide. This is all good. Thank you, guys. Okay, so these are some of the slides that we saw at the last meeting. And as much as it would be fun to read them to you again, the reason I left them in here was to see if they trigger any questions that you had as you were reading through the draft. So I'll give you the overview again. We're going to organize and update the use regulations. So your use regulations aren't organized in super bad shape right now. We're going to bring the two use tables together. You're going to see something pretty similar to what you're seeing here. Might be laid out just a little bit differently, but we'll work from household living to group living and generally go alphabetically. There are use regulations sort of scattered throughout the code, like someone just kind of took them like this. We're gonna try to bring them all together. We are also going to try to pull use regulations out of the definitions where they exist. So we one of our basic rules is to group like with like. So we're just going to try to find all things uses and bring them together here. One of the other things that we want to do is make sure the uses are modernized, that we're reflecting the uses we're seeing in the community, the uses we might see in the community, and that we've looked at how they're reviewed and permitted to move as many things as we can write good standards for to a simple administrative approval, and be careful about what goes through Planning Commission and up to City Commission. One of the questions that we want to have a conversation about with you guys that's not in here and may come up more in the administrative process is, what are we getting with conditional rezonings? Because in concept, it's not a ton different than a plan development. We are still creating one-off things as we go forward. And so it's legal, it's totally fine, but it's creating problems for future Lawrence. And so we want to talk about sort of what are the concerns, what goes on in a meeting when we do conditional rezoning, and what are we trying to address, and figure out if we can move some of those things back elsewhere into the regulations. It could be in the use table, it could be in the dimensions, could be in the approval process. So we don't know exactly. We haven't dug in yet. I don't know if anyone wants to start that conversation now or if we want to come back to it later.
Well, right now, what's in the code wasn't there until about, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And really, the way it's used now, with the way it's defined, is to fix broken zoning. So it's happening particularly in one district. Just about every property has to come in as a conditional zoning. So it's one of those things that could possibly go away if we.
Are the conditions usually about uses the neighbors don't want to see?
It's just not.
So you go through the use table and you say, not this, not this, not this.
Right. And it used to be it could knock out everything except like one.
One.
But
So it's
now
its own district that-
now it has to go through some reviews for. Is there a need? Is there any other way to get here? If you can't get there any other way, like I said, this is fixing a broken piece of code
Okay.
without having a single use.
A single use district, right. And so I'm going to ask the group, I'm sorry, this is going to be a super tacky question. Is it really fixing a broken code, or is it neighbors who realize they can do this?
No, it's a.
I don't think it's just the broken code. I think it may be broken zoning.
Okay.
So if most recently, if you have industrial zoning and somebody wants to build a restaurant and you can't have it restaurant zoning because it has to be the commercial, there's too much commercial around there, then you make it into light industrial so that you can have this quality restaurant. And then people, then everybody knows, well, there are these things in light industrial that we don't go want on a residential lot that was built as a dwelling. Is that?
Okay.
Was taking residential, say RS7, you wanted to put in a facility that puts seeds from a bin into a package and then sell that.
Oh, good.
Or put honey in a jar and sell it. That requires light industrial under the code. So you had to change it to light industrial and knock out all those uses you didn't want in a neighborhood.
Okay.
So those are the things that,
So that's probably the zoning, but the other one was.
So then.
What caused this?
Yeah.
What caused this change from 5 years ago was back when I was on the planning commission, you would have that. We want a neighborhood commercial, but we don't want people who sell loans, and we don't want people who do this. And so they go through the use table and say, yeah, we want commercial zoning so we can have a coffee shop, but we don't want, people who can sell loans. We don't want banks. We don't. And so, yeah, it was more that. So then we changed it to try to address that, to make it less of that. I think it's done some good.
I think so. I agree, though. I think it's also kind of good canary in a coal mine to tell you that there's something not diagnostically right in some of those base districts because they're only being applied in certain districts in certain intervals. That tends to give a harbinger of something not right in that base district that we'll take a look at.
But it's also indicative that if we go a form-based use and we're trying to be open enough for future uses that we don't know and don't anticipate now, it's going to be kind of a tough way to get.
I think that tells us something about that conversation. So that is all really helpful. So sometimes what we do in that case is come up with some transitional zone districts or some transitional, because we're worried about what's next to us and what's around us and what it's like. So I don't have a specific answer today, but that was really very helpful. Thank you all for that. So we'll come back around to that one. Okay, so did anyone have questions within the comments that we made in the use standards? Clean it up, make it look forward, make it easy to use. That's pretty regular stuff. I'm sure we will bump into specific uses that we want to spend more time talking about. Usually, I know that we are teed up to do an accessory dwelling unit conversation because the communities wanted to see that expanded to other districts, other residential districts. So we'll talk about that. Likely talk about a few other things in there. So we'll carry forward with this. So this first draft that you're going to see in a few months is going to be the zone districts and uses. Anything else in here for right now? So I'm going to stay on this category that just because we wrap up on the code assessment tonight doesn't mean that next weekend when you're super bored and it's 5 degrees outside and the Chiefs game's over with, if you want to go and make comments on it, please feel free, because what we'll do is take comments and carry them forward. So if you haven't had that chance to digest it, feel free, keep going. Okay, let's do the next slide. Thanks, Cal. Okay, improve and tailor development standards. So development standards, you'll remember, are those things that apply across multiple properties. So parking and lighting and landscaping and transportation connectivity. So this is where we want to go with something that's more character-based and tailored. We want to move away from development standards that are very generally drafted, and we're trying to make it fit specific situations. So what do we mean by character-based? So it's not based on whether the people that live in the neighborhood are characters, but there might be 1 or 2 neighborhoods in Lawrence that works that way. So in general, when we're looking at zoning and character, we're grouping by development pattern and rough age range, right? So we have the core of downtown, or even the original plat of Lawrence, built at a certain period of time. We have those really close in traditional neighborhoods built at a certain period of time. We have what would technically be first ring suburbs. So we're starting to come off the traditional and we're moving into the 30s and 40s at this point. We have post-war housing, and maybe that's moving into 60s and 70s suburban development. And then we're really kind of getting out to the more, ex-urban areas of the city. And we have that last kind of development. And so when we do character-based standards, what we're trying to say is if you are infilling a lot in an older commercial area, it probably should have a design that works with the older commercial area. You probably shouldn't take your 2023 Applebee's and try to cram it in there. You should maybe have something that works with it. Could still be an Applebee's, but it might not be with drive-through pickup. It might work differently. So we want to first figure out, and we think we're going to spend March and April figuring out how we're going to roughly define character within Lawrence. And we think we're putting together sort of some meetings to send out to neighborhoods and to put online to think about the community in terms of what kind of structures do we have here? What kind of vehicle transportation infrastructure do we have? What kind of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure do we have? Walk and trails? How do we what do we expect of our landscaping? What do we expect of our parking? And we're going to try to send that out into the community, both in sort of a meeting in a box and in an online walking survey, and let people tell us how they see the community and bring that back together to start defining our character areas. And then so within our character areas, we think about, do we do standard parking here or do we do some sort of adjusted parking here, right? Or do we do really specific? Are we thinking dark skies lighting out in some parts of the city and not as much downtown, or do we want dark skies everywhere? So once we know where our character areas are going to be and roughly what they're defined by, then we'll go in and look at the standards and start asking, how do we make things fit into this area? And then for new development, we think, it's not going to be the same character as what's going on in other places. So that has a more wide open palette for development. So I think I probably use at least 800 jargon words in there. But what I'm trying to say is we want to get a feel for the community and we want the development standards to match the feel for the community to the extent that they can. I mean, we're not going to do parking on a lot by lot basis, but we can do it in a way that reflects what's going on in the area.
It almost sounds like we're going to have a map with different
You're going to look,
type of.
we are going to spend some time on that map. We will all be experts on the zoning map by the time we walk out of here. It helps to think about what's going on. And then to the extent that we can do some of that hard work in the code, it changes the conversation at some of the development, redevelopment, and zoning meetings, because the places where the community might be worried about something not fitting, we've addressed some of it. We've gotten you half the way there. We're not going to get into architectural designs. We're not going to tell people where their corbels go or anything like that. But we will look at how form fits together. And that's where we'll be able to build on a lot of the work that was done in the smart code.
I wonder if one way to look at that is like the BZA and all our variances.
Yeah, we will look through the variances. Yeah.
Because I know we run into that a lot where, we set some parking standard, but in this area of town, we're always getting a variance on.
Right.
It works very well over here, but it doesn't work here. Looking at through the way our variances are, that might help define where some of those
Mhm.
character lines are, where this doesn't work, but this works.
Usually we spend some time digging through variances, kind of like digging through old meeting notes. You never know what's going to be hiding in there. So we'll do that. Anything else along these lines? Okay, let's do the next slide. What are we doing on time? Environmentally sensitive areas and incorporate sustainability. So since we last met, we had the opportunity to talk to, Kathy Reynolds. Is that right? Right name? Richardson, sorry about that. And learn about what's going on in terms of sustainability planning. And so as I believe as the city and county move forward with climate action plan, there will be some more detailed information in there about sustainability. And we're going to try to organize our drafting so we can pick up on where they're going with that. In terms of zone districts and USA, one of the ways to make a community or keep a community sustainable is to focus on compact development. When the footprint of the development is smaller, we make it easier for people to walk. We tend to use less water. And we tend not to sprawl out into more environmentally sensitive areas that we're trying to, no, seeing a no down there, conserve. So, yeah. So this is an area that we'll do across all three of the drafting segments. So sustainability, a good sustainable code has sustainability in the districts and uses, has sustainability written into the development standards, and has sustainability as a review criteria for development. So this is sustainability is going to be one of our overarching themes. Protecting environmentally sensitive areas is a place where we're going to take what's currently in the code, bring it forward and update it. It could be a little more expansive in what it covers. It could be a little more explanatory actually in what it covers. All right, questions about this? No, yeah.
I had a question about the steep slopes one. I saw that in the code assessment report, and it sounds like there's a desire to limit development at all on steep slopes. And I was wondering what the rationale was behind that, given that other cities can do it and that we're trying to do infill development, and our interior tends to be more hilly than our exterior.
So we typically find a slope percentage that the community agrees is so steep that the engineering involved isn't worth the effort. That's usually 30% or over. So we will have a conversation about whether or not there's a cutoff place. 30% is pretty steep when you're talking about putting development in. So below that, we'll talk about, finding the flattest, safest place on the lot to build, or allowing people to move density around. So if you're doing the subdivision, you can cluster it and make the most of the site that way. But I don't think we're at no. I think we're at being thoughtful about how that type of development impacts the community.
If the complexity and difficulty of engineering and construction is the cost borne by the property owner, why should anybody else have a say in if they can do it or not, if it doesn't affect anything else other than just that it's on a slope? Like if you really want a house on stilts that's on a 50% slope or whatever, I mean, it seems like you should be able to have that as long as you're not causing a landslide, right?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm a member of Republic.
Hi.
I'm an architect that worked in Seattle. The issue is that you are endangering the public by working on a steep slope, because you could undermine that entire site and have that site cave out, go into your other neighbors, and basically have a mudslide or something. So I'm not opposed to working on a steep slope, but there are public welfare and safety issues that come with it. So it should be addressed in some way. It shouldn't be limited, but we should find a way.
Regulated, right?
It should be regulated.
Yeah.
Like in Seattle, they had a wet season limitation. You couldn't work on steep slopes between October and March. So you find ways, once again, to work within the constraints that allows people to be able to do what they want to do on their own private lot, but doesn't impact the neighbors.
Yep, I agree.
You have to have certain amount of shoring that goes up if you have a site that has geological issues with it. So.
Thank you.
And I'm thinking that most of the streets that I try to ride up to get to the university are 14%, 17%. So that's much less, even though it's hilly in the middle, it's much less than the 30% that you're talking about. So that may give you some idea of, I think the 11th Street is somewhere between 14 and 17%.
So maybe a moot point after all.
What?
So it might be a moot point after all if we really don't
Yeah.
have anything quite that steep. Yeah.
Too much study.
But it's good for sledding. 11th Street.
Oh, mostly for cars. The entertainment is when it's icy, you just.
And the entertainment's watching Marcy write down.
So, okay, thank you. Okay, so we will hit this one in our second drafting module for the most part, a little bit in the first one. Let's go ahead, Kyle. Okay, so few slides just about the code foundations. Big goal is to draft for predictability. The current regulations have some amount of subjectivity. So an applicant needs to come through and needs to get director approval, or the code says we're gonna ask you to do the best thing in this circumstance. We want to move a little bit more to, we want you to do one of these three things. We want to make it easier to say, I hit the thing I'm supposed to hit. That is, it's a problem-solving problem. When the code says we're looking at the director to make this decision, that's just something that needs to be solved. That's going to take time, that adds time to the review process. It's common in older codes to see that. We went through a code drafting period of time when the code, just the whole code was pretty much whatever the director says it's going to be. And which was, we thought that was a great way to get through, but it turns out it's a long way to get through. So we will move to objective standards where we can. We will eliminate duplicated information and reconcile inconsistencies. We've heard from staff and the public that just the language of the code is a problem. So as we clean up, we'll get through that.
So it's sort of like not saying small scale.
We're going to try to find all of those buzzy words and come up with a different way to say it. My least favorite is harmony, which ends up in development standards and design codes and doesn't work so well. But if you have a hit list of words that are in the code that hang you up somewhere, we'd love to hear about it. Anybody on the appropriate is a problem.
I feel like compatibility is something that comes up all the time.
Compatibility is
It's like metal for who, right?
so, and all of these words are a problem where they have no context, right? It's easier to figure out compatibility when you say the compatibility means it's within a size range of 20% of whatever's going on next to it. Well, then you can get to compatible pretty quickly. So, so we.
Will they be retired, those terms retired at the same ceremony as the smart codes?
I hope so. I know, I would like a second ceremony.
Okay, we'll have.
Ceremonies as we can have. More cake for everybody.
I had a quick question about the idea of predictability. I've been trying to follow the sort of urbanist news as well as I can, and it seems like in cities that are loosening up their zoning code or changing entirely, some of those cities are also pre-approving certain designs for missing middle housing that, maybe people aren't used to seeing. So it's nice to get out ahead of it and say, like, this is something that we generally agree is going to look okay in most neighborhoods. So if you're a developer and you want to put this on a lot, or if you're a property owner and you want that as an ADU, should be fine. As long as it fits, it's cool. And then that can take some of the unpredictability out as well. Is that something that would be written into a code or a design guideline or?
Yeah, so the adoption of pre-approved plan sets happens after the code. We are seeing that we're seeing it most often for ADUs because that's going to help a residential property owner get forward in the process and stop some of the arguing about whether or not it's acceptable. But that would have to be something that the city would do after the code gets in place. We do want to spend time talking about missing middle housing. That's one of the things we want to talk about. Something that we see in different communities is that sometimes the missing middle doesn't get built because over time, the development community has found it challenging to get approved or has moved away from it. And we have lost some institutional memory of how to do that product. There are probably people in the community who remember how to do it. And we do try to have some conversations across the code about, hey, what's getting in the way of missing middle housing? Why aren't we seeing it built? Is it the zoning? Is it what we think the market wants? And so we will dive deep into that. Okay, next slide. User-friendly code. You guys are probably going to just get sick of hearing about this slide. So we're going to more images and we're going to more tables. The code is likely going to get longer because graphics are bigger. So I don't want anyone to have heart failure about that. We're thinking it's going to be an electronic document. The city is going to codify it in Unicode. But I just want to go out on the limb and say page number is not indicative of good code or bad code. We're all going to be judges of whether it's good or bad at the end of it, regardless of how many pages we have. Somebody's going to tell me more than 15 pages is too much code. I'm going to hear it. It's going to happen. They might tell Gabby instead of me. But we're going to base the code on what we think the city needs. And so if you think we're doing more than we need to do, please say so. We're happy to take pages out and claim it later. But just letting you know, when we start adding illustrations and graphics, we try to make them big enough so people can see it and it takes up space on the page. Okay,
Next.
next.
Replace a bunch of words with a few pictures. We'll take.
We will try to replace a bunch of words
It
with
might be a
pictures.
lot simpler.
Yeah, that's what we want to do. And then we find that people come in and argue with us about the pictures. So it is, so someone's gonna come in and say, I'm not putting a blue roof on my house. That conversation is gonna happen and Jeff is gonna look at them and very gently say, no, you don't have to put a blue roof on your house. But we do put some words with the graphics to say this is an illustration and you can do whatever roof you want to, but we're talking about location or shape or something here. But yes, we do try to do images instead of lots of description. Okay, next slide.
So you can paint.
Let's do the development processes. We are going to update the development processes, and we know that there is a lot going on in the administration and procedure section of the code that we want to fix. You guys might remember we talked about neighborhood meetings at our last meeting, whether or not to add them, and we have different thoughts about whether or not they're going to be useful. What we think going into this is we're going to start drafting districts and uses, but we have some more questions we want to tee up about procedures because we want more time to talk about them. So we're going to keep going with the neighborhood meeting discussion. And we're probably going to start some other procedural conversations early so we know we're going to draft later. So we're going to work with staff to flag those conversations to figure out where things could move more smoothly or where we're missing procedures. So processes get stopped. We understand that the code calls for something to happen, but there may not be a procedure actually assigned to it. And there may be procedures that we look at and we're not sure what we use them with. So we want to start that matching process early. And we want to ask questions about improving procedures as we go. Staff and the public have identified this as a place where we can use some good. And maybe we can celebrate with a cake at the end of that. If we manage to do something good, we'll see. That might be popsicles. We'll see where we're at.
Just 3 ceremonies?
I'm three. Are you keeping track?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. One. So in addition to what we're doing with drafting, we're going to be reaching out to the public and doing some surveying. And you may see that some of that surveying is stuff that's going to happen later in the code because we're trying to pull information in earlier so we can have conversations about it. Questions about procedures?
So at the last meeting, I had brought up the idea of moving the procedures part up in the process to see if we could get a more simplified or an expedited procedure put in place and start working with that while we're working on some of the other code revisions. Am I kind of hearing that that's not something that you recommend as part of this process, or is that something that we should talk about?
Yeah, so we can talk about that. Our issue there would be, we'd be appending new procedures onto old code. And that's going to be sort of a Franken code by the end of it. Also, and I do appreciate that drafting it first might help see some progress, that we can see that we can resolve some of this. Sometimes procedural problems are actually substance problems because we have open-ended issues in the code that get stalled because it takes a staff discussion to get through it, or we're going back and forth with the applicant 3 or 4 times to figure out how something is going to get resolved. And so our reason for drafting procedures last is to resolve as many of the problems that lead up to procedural delay as possible and then clean up the procedures. But, you know, we have drafted procedures first in other communities. It's, you know, it tends to work a little better if we do it last. And so I think I would ask if there is, any movement in the group on that. I would ask if there's, movement from the staff on that. But I don't think doing it first is going to get any current applications through any faster.
I could see slowing it down if it has to go through certain commissions when you're arguing about which rules to apply at the time, but
it would be, it would slow down the whole project, most likely, if we wanted to do that and then append it to the current regulations. So I'm not sure whether it would be enough of a fix to be worth it. But you guys are all closer to it than we are. So we are a little more hands off. We have drafting reasons why we wouldn't do it, but I guess I would ask if it would really make an improvement that would be worth the effort.
would there be scenarios where it could expedite the process? I mean, for the folks that are inside of it.
I would be a little concerned about administrative approval if it's not the code that we want to aim towards. Right, so all of a sudden, and I think that's the mix between the existing code. I think we're wanting a code that is more clear about exactly what you have to do. And then it's easier to approve it administratively because we've all agreed that it's not Harmony, it's 20%.
I think the other part of that is, some of the slowness in our process is because we require so much process and we have lots of rezonings because our zoning categories maybe are so narrow that we have to rezone. Whereas if you create these different zoning districts and then we across the board rezone things to these new districts, then you have, all of a sudden you don't have to rezone this thing from IL to, CN so you can build something, or you don't need to rezone this to RMO so you can put some housing on top of it. It's already allowed by that right. So I'm also excited to get to that point, and obviously on the affordable housing side of it, if you allow some density, if you allow, whatever duplexes or ADUs or whatever by right within districts, then you're able to do that. So, I think some of those changes are actually going to be more useful in solving some of those problems, as you said, than the procedure. But I guess a related question is, you did mention late in the report about an affordable housing zone or maybe some processes related towards trying to get housing done quicker.
Quickly, yeah.
And I think our biggest issue is housing, not so much quickly trying to rezone things to commercial or industrial. So I wonder, I wrote that down as, depending on what you're thinking there, is that something we could consider early in the process to address some of the housing issues? Again, because in many ways, those are much less controversial than especially in greenfield development. I think most of the concerns about going too quick are going to be going too quick in infill, that one lot, as opposed to having a process that's quicker to get dense, affordable housing. And I'm using the little A there, not the big A. Affordable housing in a greenfield in West Lawrence. Is there a way to look at that? So I didn't know exactly what you meant by affordable housing zone, and maybe that could be something we look at.
Maybe there's something in there that if it's not as wide as all of the procedures, but it's more narrowly focused on greenfield residential development.
Yeah, and that was really the premise of my thought there is there a way that we can expedite housing? Because if we're already in this incredible shortage and we're looking at it takes 2 years to develop the dirt and however long to build, we're already at a critical point.
Yeah.
So.
But again, we're talking there greenfield, not the empty lot on 11th Street.
But Greenfield's not any easier.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We could,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. If we could expedite that process, that's what you're talking about.
If we had a zoning category now that we could zone greenfield annexation with, that could help speed it up.
Something like that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm not,
But
we're going to really work our way through it. There's
right.
to get greenfield housing going, there's a lot of procedural stuff that maybe we just need to focus on that for a little bit. Because you're really, from my read of your assessment, we kept talking about infill and redevelopment. And that is such a narrow, small, that's where Plan 2040 missed the boat. That's the problem, is we've already exhausted most of the affordable lots. And so we're doing all this work for a really dwindling amount of issues. And our whole hurdle is to get get the Greenfield stuff going and we can't get that going. And so,
Why not?
because Plan 2040 has set all these hurdles for us to annex and get ground going and jump the SLT. I mean, that's a mental block for us right now as a community. We can't figure out how to do that. We didn't lay any groundwork to develop on the other side of the SLT. Goes back to utility planning, infrastructure planning. We didn't do any of that. So now we have a plan that doesn't have any plans to be on the other side of the SLT. So now we're continuing to not do any infrastructure planning. I mean, it just snowballs once you get into that.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I kind of like to add to that. The way I see it is that the issue with redevelopment, infill is the code.
Okay.
The code doesn't allow for density. So then we have to turn to greenfield. So it's not one or the other, it should be both. And that right now, the only way we can get density within the core of Lawrence is to do what we're doing and rethink the zoning and allowing not only single family homes in one district, allowing duplexes, maybe triplexes. Figuring out how to have affordable multi-tenant units on one lot instead of thinking of this being a single family town. Because it's just not gonna fly. I mean, we're not gonna be able to build enough single family homes on, from here to Tonganoxie.
And I think that's what the difference is. I think we have to work through all the rest of it. I mean, we're talking about, which is taking a house on 11th Street and possibly making it a duplex, or taking a gas station and turning it into a 3-story, coffee shop with apartments above it. That, I think, that procedure is gonna have to follow after we get the zoning districts down and the other. I mean, I see that and I think those are gonna be part and parcel for each other. But Phil, to your question is, I mean, putting aside Plan 2040 and infrastructures or something in the code that would help us do greenfield development. My only concern about that is I think when we talk about a greenfield development now with lots of housing, we'd also like to see some of this mixed use, all that stuff too. And some of that's not allowed in the current code, and it's going to be allowed when we have these new.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about some of these new districts. I mean, I think the youth, we can make, those are going to turn into some great neighborhood stuff, But
but so
to wait until we get to there to even get started is.
To bring us back to the procedures piece of it, could we get ourselves a couple of months into the zone districts and uses? Because that sounds like a big piece of what's getting in the way of both redevelopment and greenfield development. If we get closer and see that we can put a housing specific fix in place, we could do that midway through.
Okay.
Does that seem, so because if we clean up the districts, that's the baseline for what we've got to get to move some of the rest of it forward. What are you going to say?
Have that mixed use housing available.
Yeah.
As, a flexible range of annexation. I think that is going to help a lot because we're really stuck with trying to update area plans and all types of other things are getting in the way with the current code. But if we could get resolution on some type that can go out that provides some degree of flexibility that we're looking towards at the end here, because we'll have we're already focusing on that idea of these mixed uses.
Okay.
We could have our first mixed use housing.
And I was going to say the commercial uses,
Yeah.
I think are going to have the least concern and the most excitement, maybe for Hillcrest or, some of those other smaller districts that adding some housing could be, above the bowling alley, if you have enough insulation.
Wouldn't that be great?
But anyway, I think that it would
There's a
be
couple of movies
interesting.
made about
It would be interesting to see what, if that could be added as a new district to our current code. Right.
Like that.
So, well, let's move ourselves
Yeah.
forward, but
Okay, yes.
holding this conversation about where some of our real biggest problems are. And
Or opportunities.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of, where's the really
Where's
opportunity?
the opportunity, and do we midway through decide to jump on that opportunity if we think we've cleaned up enough?
Mhm.
So not neither one nor the other. Let's move them both forward. Okay. Okay, next slide. Special topics. Okay, so we think these three topics are going to kind of permeate our discussion. And they all come together in different ways. So zoning for affordable housing, that's a capital A, but there should be a small a there also. And drafting for equity, they're drafting in terms of what's in the code, thinking about how we stay equitable within the community, what's in the procedures, to think about how we include new voices in our processes, and what are we doing, and particularly staff and the consultant team to get further out into the community. And so we will be, as we pick up steam across 2023, doing a lot more of us out in the community, talking to people, and maybe a few less things, having people come to us here. Gabby and I were brainstorming, what were we brainstorming? Something at Free State that involved bingo and design standards. I don't know. We'll get back to you guys when we have that together. And ensuring environmental sustainability. So these will be our big three that we look at as we're drafting districts, as we're drafting standards, as we're drafting procedures. And we'll do a check back with the community to see, are we meeting where you want to be on these three topics, and what else can we do to get there? And so you'll see these kind of almost at the end of the assessment. You can read about them a little bit more. We have an affordable housing plan coming out and a climate action plan coming out over the next few months. So we'll be thinking about how those become part of the process. And then we're working towards including working with the city's equity and inclusion and communications and creativity departments to help guide what we're doing with the project. So let's go ahead a little bit more. Okay, so website feedback. The code assessment document is on the project website, and it's posted in a website format that allows people to comment on it, and you can read other people's comments. So it's open for community conversation. And so if you want to go share any of your comments on the draft, or if you want to send people to the draft on the website to comment on it, we have some comments on there and we're looking for more. We're trying to figure out where people want to see more of something or less of something. And so that's going to be up. I think we'll probably leave that up for at least a couple more weeks. And so we'll let people do that. We will gather those comments and share them back with the public. We are in the process of putting together a new place on the website. That's what we're hearing in the community. We're starting to receive submissions from the community, and we want to be able to share those with everybody. So what are we going to do with comments? So we'll compile the comments, and we will review them during the drafting process. We'll share the comments with you. We'll share the comments with the Planning Commission. And then, to the extent that there is a continuing theme in the comments, and it appears to be community supported change, we will work to address those issues. Where we are going to look for your feedback and look for Planning Commission feedback is where we're seeing comments that come in just for one or two people. Sometimes someone says something that's incredibly important, but one person says it. And sometimes 15 people say something that we have no control over. And so some of what do we do with public comment is just talking about, this is what we're hearing, this is what the public is saying, here's where the code is going, here's where the plans are, and trying to figure out what our path forward is. One of the things that's so important about this group is the range of perspectives that you bring to the table. And so we'll try to make sure that we're having this comment conversation and, bringing that feedback in. Ultimately, we think that, the comments, the formal comments that get submitted probably should go to planning commission, because that's kind of their job, but that's something that we're going to want to talk about as we go forward. And I think, Brad, you have some thoughts about that too, that you might want to share. Do you want to do that now, or you want to do it at the end of the?
I mean, I think we can talk about that now. We have yet, ultimately, the city commission will pass something.
Correct.
Question is, how do we get from here to that vote? Again, is what is ultimately recommended to the city commission? Is that the consultant's recommendation? Is that this committee's recommendation? Is the planning commission's recommendation? And, I think those are all pretty intertwined, and at some point we want to get very close, but we won't necessarily have where that is. So I think that's what we want to continue to work on as we walk through this process, is, as we hear that feedback. And obviously, if, people have all sorts of opinions, and something has to be presented to the city commission. But how do we get to what that is I think, what you're leading towards. Typically, it's the planning commission. That is the entity that hears at last, and they're the one that recommends something to us. Not that we always agree with the planning commission, but that's the last body. But how do we get to there, I think, is still kind of something we'll work through as we get there. This body is really important because it's the one it has a broad range of input, which is why you guys are so important to influence that as it moves along.
Speaking as the role as planning commission in here, it would be helpful if you had the public comments and it ran through this committee. So that it had the steering committee's comments also when it's presented in the modules. Because then it would be easier for the city commission to ultimately track where the changes and where the change,
I hear what you're saying. And we kind of talked about this, just started this conversation. I think that ultimately one of the things that we're trying to be respectful of is your time. And so adding public comments on to what we're already asking you to bring to the table with your experience. We didn't want to double up your time commitment because now you have a list of public comments.
Time commitment of the steering committee.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody seems to care about the time commitment of the planning commission.
No, we don't care about that.
No, you signed up for it. So I think maybe at our next meeting, we want to, go away and think about this and come back and have a more full conversation. But I don't want to, us to get comments and say, no, these are never going to the steering committee. If steering committee wants to see them, but you do have a job separate from sorting public comments. And so we just wanted to make sure that everyone was in the same place with at least that piece of it.
So, but I think part of your proposal might have been to say, do we track the comments of the steering committee? Right.
It'd be helpful to know what public comments, what filtered through here, what this steering committee, which represents a different component of the city, has to say about what the general public is saying.
But I think we're different from either the planning commission or the city commission, because we're probably not going to take a vote and say,
no, but we could have.
But so then how do we know we come to consensus? Because there's still going to be comments that are going to come from us individually, as opposed to this is a steering committee comment. Because I think everybody has that different perspective and that input. And I don't think this body should have to say, we're going to all agree on the same thing.
Right.
I think we ought to just add to the discussion. And then, if we're really energized, put in our comments.
So we need to both put our input in the steering committee and then go online and put our input in as public as well. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, no, you don't have to.
No, I was trying to understand what Marcy was.
Yeah.
Is that what you just said?
Well, I'm saying, I don't know how our comments here are getting, you're reacting to them but they're not going to be part of the comment process, right?
Well, so we're taking notes of these meetings,
Right.
just like we did the last one, and we will continue to publish the notes. So
Okay.
we effectively become part of the comment process. At least in terms of, it says steering committee. So we don't say Marcy said this
Oh,
or
right.
Brad said that. And when we get public comments that are, general comments, we're not going to put names on those either. We're kind of just throwing everything in the bunch. So maybe, I don't think we need to resolve this tonight, but maybe we inform this conversation with what we're hearing from the public. I mean, you don't want to not know about the public, but I don't think you have to
React.
thumbs up or thumbs down the public, right? So, but I think this is maybe a conversation we have when we have a draft in front of us and have public comments in front of us and see what the lift is going to be to get through that. I keep looking at you guys. I feel like I need to sit on the other side of the table and stare at this side now.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get this finished up, so you guys can go home, and get warm. It is nice and warm in here. Gabby and I had a meeting last week in a room that was 45 degrees, and so this is it's lovely and civilized.
Oh, sorry, I just have one more question about
Yeah.
the website. So it looks like there's supposed to be functionality around like liking and replies that you can then filter by stuff,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem to be possible to actually reply or like comments yet. So I don't know if that's just my computer's broken or if the functionality is not enabled, but you may want to have an IT guy. look
We're
into
checking
that.
it. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
It doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, thank you. Because it should allow you to comment on comments.
It's open, yeah.
Okay, we've kind of been discussing the whole time, but is there anything we haven't touched on that you guys have on your list that we want to bring up tonight?
Liz, if this is the last slide of your presentation, if it is, we can take it down and see the people who are on Zoom with us.
Yeah, let's, I don't think, the last few slides are a calendar, so let's
Bring it
take this
back up
down.
here,
We can
that's
bring it
fine.
back. Yeah.
Hi, this is Kay Johnson. I don't know if you're looking for specific comments, but I was looking at the section on environment and natural resources, which is on page 7 or 8, between 7 and 8 of the 63 pages. I don't see wildlife protected, or there's several places that I could add in my mind. Wildlife, you've got identify, preserve, and protect wetlands, but also wetlands are to protect the wildlife. So it seems like to me in several wildlife habitat and transportation limits to impacts to wildlife are also should be included in some fashion in these sections. I see that wildlife habitats is listed in the chapter 2 paragraph, but I also don't see that in, and maybe that's because of the specific plan 2040 pages, but I don't know.
Right, so the stuff on in chapter 2 and this pages, your 7 and 8, that is from Plan 2040. Those are the goals and actions from the plan.
That's
So we-
kind of
we
what I
won't
was
be changing
wondering.
those. Did we miss
Okay.
them?
No, I thought that's probably what it was, but it seems like then they needed to be picked up in the other sections. But I don't know what section that would be to include wildlife. You know, we've got an expansion getting ready to start with SLT. We have wildlife on one side of it as well as residential, and a kind of a wildlife buffer on the other side. And now we're talking about building walls for noise and things like that. But how do we get the wildlife to be able to migrate back and forth? That adds to the importance of the wildlife. Wildlife does make a difference in our lives.
Yeah, so you might want to try around page 31, the very end of this part 2, right before the beginning of part 3. There's a list in there of enhancing the environmentally sensitive land standards. And the last thing on there is identify important wildlife habits and prioritize them for protection and conservation.
Okay, and then just add comments in that area.
Yeah, you can add comments in that area, absolutely. Or you can tell us right now what else you wanted to add to that. But
Because
if
I
you wanna
don't,
give it a look-
I don't necessarily see that this is, some of that area is not considered sensitive lands, but it does, there are trails and natural preserve areas in that particular area where I'm talking about, but there are other areas too. Especially where the rural versus the urban touch. So we still have wildlife that we want to encourage into our areas, and we also don't want them to be hit by traffic or whatever, but because that also causes problems, impacts to people too. But so that what I was just trying to figure out is where, you know, the purpose of maintaining and improving wildlife habitat is for the wildlife.
Okay.
So,
Okay, thank you.
mhm.
Do we want to talk about wildlife corridors?
I don't have a problem with that.
Because it is important to know where wildlife is moving or what development we're proposing that restricts important movement.
Yeah, and I don't know what kind of studies have been done about wildlife habitat movements, particularly around the SLT.
Okay. We know we'll be getting to that in the second round of drafting. So we'll think about where wildlife habitat might be, where the corridors might be, how we protect wildlife for the sake of wildlife, not necessarily for anything the humans are up to. And how do we maintain and improve those areas?
And if you're wondering what I'm really thinking about, I like nature bridges, whether they're overpass or underpass, or at least gaps between walls, because you don't want to block off and totally wall off wildlife on one side, wildlife on the other.
Yeah, that's it. That's helpful. One of the things that we're going to think about as we do our drafting is what we put in the land development code and what needs to be handled by engineering design standards. And this is one of those things that crosses both of those. So we'll bring that conversation forward.
Great, thanks.
Uh-huh. Anybody else?
I would just add real quick, and we talked briefly about it. And again, I know you're going to incorporate some of the stuff, I mean, from the small code. I mean, I was on the planning commission when we adopted that.
Yeah.
Thought great things would happen, but
Yeah.
never got used. So there's clearly problems with it, but some of those ideas of, incentivizing being close to transit or incentivizing some of those things. I thought were really good ideas that never really took off, but incorporating some of those, at least, I think it could be good to see some of those,
Yeah.
in the new code, as well as the form-based stuff.
Yep.
I don't envision how those two work together, but I look forward to it. And then, again, as I was reading through this already, the first couple people who had commented, some of them at the very beginning were talking about we need to collapse these residential zoning districts because we want, ADUs and duplexes and, some of that by right. Then later, and you talk about that, having that in there. So I still think there's confusion about what the zoning districts mean versus, what the uses are within those zoning districts,
Right.
what the form is.
Right.
And again, I think other people will be concerned about the form of, they might not care about the duplex as long as it looks like a certain form.
Right, right.
These sorts of, so not just, so again, I think that goes back to your character
Right.
sort of idea about how those are lined up. So, but I think we're already seeing lots of comments about that. So I think that'll be interesting.
It's something that we've seen with ADUs is that they get more traction sometimes in a community when they're designed differently in different locations. When you've thought about if you're putting this in your backyard, it can't be any taller than this because the neighbors actually don't want it blocking what's going on. So we'll try to figure out what some of the issues are there. Okay, so it looks like we're getting ready for our next.
So people are showing up, which is good.
Excellent. This is excellent. Anything else?
Nick, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, it's a very general kind of question. So since we've been talking about zones collapsing, expanding, carrying forward, striking from the code. Given the sort of progress towards more mixed use zoning, it's not really progress, it's more of a return. That's how we've always built cities.
Right.
And also what's going on around the country where some cities and some entire states are doing away with exclusive single family detached residential zoning. And given the fact that every other developed country on earth doesn't have that, is there any potential for maybe re-examining the need for a exclusive single family detached residential zone? In as much as maybe even somebody has an acre lot, maybe they want an ADU, yeah. Or if somebody has an acre lot, is a duplex so wrong? I mean, I've seen apartments in the countryside, it's weird, but it doesn't really hurt anything, right? If somebody wants to have a farm store on their property, I think that actually sort of allowed, it's like a farm stand. But if you want to run an office out of your ranch on the edge of town, it seems like as long as we're careful with form-based standards and appropriate uses, that there maybe wouldn't be a huge loss of that exclusivity. So I don't know if that's something that's in the works or not, or that's possible, but just bring it up.
So these days when we draft a code, we usually bring it back. So in the past, there would be like a whole range of single family districts, and then you do a whole range of multifamily districts. Right now, what we're doing is really bringing that multifamily in the form of single family attached way back into the single family districts. So maybe leaving one or two just single family detached districts, and everybody else can have a duplex or can have a triplex, or we're treating those very similar to a single family detached. So yes, we will start that discussion by showing a wider range of housing available in almost all the districts.
Okay. On that kind of same thought path, it sounds like you're basically building sort of graduated phases of intensity of development in each of these zones. Do you think it would make sense to keep them hierarchical in that, say, intense zone number 1, you can do everything that you could do in the lower intensity zone number 2, but it's kind of a one-way street. So kind of like what they do in Japan, for example, where like in the most intense zone, you can do literally anything if you have the money. But in the least intense zone, you can really only do very low intensity uses.
Isn't that typically what we do with Euclidean? Are you taking it into more?
So like currently,
zoning?
yeah. So currently in say a commercial zone, you can't also build a single family home, right? Whereas, I mean, if you're crazy enough to want to build a home next to Walmart and Target, all right, do what you got to do, right? But it's not necessarily prohibited.
Well, by going to more mixed use, that is effectively what we're doing.
Okay.
But in some of those mixed use districts, we actually say single family detached is not appropriate here.
Oh, so it's just disallowed entirely.
It's just disallowed because it is a huge expectation problem. So someone buys a single family detached and then they're irritated that the commercial lights are on next to them. It could be, completely buyer beware, but it's a lot more effective just to say, don't build single family detached here. And that's if we're going for and we're looking to get to density, I don't want someone taking it up with single family detached.
Do you think that market forces may affect that one way or another? So if the cost of the land is $150,000 for a 3,000 square foot lot, you would have to build a pretty big house to get your money's worth out of something like that. Whereas a 1,000 to 2,000 square foot house would be a really dumb idea to build on something like that, right? I mean,
I never discount the dumb ideas.
okay. I mean, and even if it does happen, if they're complaining, what are they gonna do about it, right? Like the zoning says what it is. Everybody's conforming to the standards.
It's all true, but that doesn't stop people from going to the city commission and taking up a lot of time talking about what they don't like. So
I mean, you guys are used to that already, right? Nothing different, really.
it's nothing different, but if we can stop a few things like that from happening. I appreciate that, the market should, but these days the housing market is so completely sideways that a few bumpers are okay, I think.
Well, I know we have other people coming in.
I had just one
Yep.
other, one thing that jumped out to me, Elizabeth, when I was at this, I noticed that some of your community survey results were in the back of the report. The one thing that jumped out to me was that one of the things that Lawrence citizens like was single family homes with yards. Obviously, our conversation has been focused a lot on density and infill.
Yep.
And I absolutely agree with the comment earlier that we're not going to build single family homes from here to Lecompton, but I'm concerned that the focus of where we're headed with this is not compatible necessarily with what the community is saying that they want. And from a market perspective, are we considering what the market wants, what the community is telling us that they want, and are we planning for that? So just a comment that I wanted to.
I don't think we're stopping single family development. I don't think the code is gonna outright ban it. I think that the conversation will be around, what other forms of missing middle could and should be sold in the community. The discussions we've had so far have been not a lot of it's getting built, not a lot of it's getting sold. It's a gap in the market. And so I think it's hard to say whether that's all people really only want the single family detached when they haven't been presented with a lot of other choices on the market right now. And that's not uncommon. That's not just a Lawrence issue. Other communities are facing that too. So, I think the conversation around housing is what can be built, where is it appropriate to be built, how does that meet what the community wants, and who is not in the community now that would be if there were affordable housing or other housing choices here, and also who won't be in the community if things keep getting more expensive.
Sure. And I agree. I think our market can support housing of a lot of different types, some of which we're not actively exploring right now. But I think there is also a market demand for things that I think it's different to say we're not banning it, but we're also not encouraging it. We're not creating an atmosphere where that development is happening. And that's where my concern is. We're creating an atmosphere where I think the development community is hearing a message that that's not what we want. So I want to make sure that we're careful with where the expectations are and where the intentions are.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's wrap up, Alan, so you can get to your next one and
Thank
get the,
So quick, as you guys walk out the door, one more minute. So we will not have the draft ready until late March. But we think that there is perhaps an interim meeting, and we can talk about this by email with everybody to share what we think some of the community outreach around character is going to look like. So we're trying to put together a website survey or attach that to a walking tour and do a meeting in a box. So neighborhood groups could grab it and do it, or you could get 6 of your friends together and have a beer and do community character. But we would like to share that with you guys before it goes public. So we think maybe a February, early March meeting will be when that's ready to go. So we'll work with Becky and Jeff and get an email out and figure out what a good time to meet is. And we'll do that probably virtually, and then we'll get that ready to go. And then we'll see you back here probably early April.
excellent.
Okay?
Okay,
All right.
thank you.
Thanks for everything tonight, guys. Really appreciate it. All right, we're gonna switch out. We've got a presentation, short presentation.